Hello everyone. This Wednesday we have yet another comprehensive lineup of every single business story you need to know about from right across Africa. From Cairo to Lagos, Nairobi and Johannesburg, we've certainly got you covered. Here's what's coming up. We'll be looking at how companies in Ebola-affected countries are keeping operations above water. Sudan's population is fairly angry. They're calling on the governments to control the prices of basic commodities. And why have SMEs surged in Zimbabwe despite the economic crisis that has lingered in the country? Let's start tonight with some fairly big numbers in hand. $32.6 billion to be specific. That's the amount that the World Bank estimates the current Ebola outbreak could cost West African economies as a whole through to the end of 2015 if the response to the current outbreak is slow and uncoordinated. The 7-month-long outbreak has scared away many investors, and it has led Liberia, the worst affected country, to cut its annual growth estimate. Safety, of course, is a concern for many employers. However, the world's biggest steel and mining group with operations in Liberia is determined to keep its employees safe and production stable. CCTV's Katerina Vitozzi starts us off in the capital, Monrovia.
36.5.
He may be in charge of Liberia's biggest iron ore port, but Dennis Folds goes through Ebola health screenings like every other member of staff. A temperature check and a hand-washing station.
Okay.
At this site, ArcelorMittal has 220 workers. There's not been a single Ebola case amongst them.
I don't know of any case of anyone who's been nervous not to come to work. They know the environment they have here, in my opinion, is probably a lot safer than what they've got in the city. So the workplace, there's a lot of hand wash stations in the cities and the towns and that now, but not all of them have, to get to work, have 4 thermal checks on the temperature checks, 4 hand wash stations, uniforms. They get a lot of protection here, and the protection is from the top to bottom, and they are looking after each other. And I think they actually, I'm not saying prefer to be, but they're quite happy to be here, and they're quite happy to be at work.
This is Buchanan Port on Liberia's southern coast. From here, ArcelorMittal exports 5 million tonnes of iron ore every year to China and Europe. Despite the Ebola outbreak, short-term production is still on track.
We are pretty much on target, and again, it's all down to the safety procedures, what we're taking. We're not cutting any corners, we're not taking any chances. Even before the Ebola, the motto is safety first always, and that's what it always is. We've just made it, the topic has just got a lot more serious, and the whole scenario of Ebola is massive, and the more we can talk to them, the safer we're going to be.
Much of Liberia's post-war economic future was based on the country's mining sector. Before the epidemic, growth was slated for 7% this year. The government has slashed those estimates, but despite an uncertain future and its own partly stalled expansion plans, ArcelorMittal is staying put.
The same can't be said for every company operating in Liberia. Over the past 7 months, concerns about the safety of employees has led many foreign investors to shut up shop in Liberia. But ArcelorMittal is spearheading a group of West African businesses, trying to get them to commit to staying in the region, as well as providing support and funding to the government as well as local communities to help beat this virus. Katerina Vitozzi, CCTV, Monrovia.
Well, speaking of Liberia, its Transport Minister Angela Castle-Bush has voluntarily submitted herself for quarantine after her driver died of Ebola. The Deputy Information Minister, Isaac Jackson, disclosed this to reporters in Monrovia and also said that reports that Castle-Bush had the disease are, quote, false and misleading, end of quote. The deceased, Ndimene Sumo, was directly assigned to the minister, but he made no direct contact with her since his last day of work on the 3rd of October. Jackson said Castle Bush decided to voluntarily isolate itself for a period of 21 days purely as a precaution. Similarly, Transport Ministry officials have requested the Ministry of Health in Liberia to decontaminate the entire building in which that unit of the executive is based. Now, thousands of Mozambicans cast their vote on Wednesday for a new leader who they expect will reform their economy. The Southern African nation has a fairly large number of minerals, including newly discovered coal and vast natural gas reserves, which Mozambicans hope the country can leverage to turn their lives around. You see, the majority of the 25 million inhabitants of the Southern African country live on less than $2 a day. Unemployment, unequal distribution of wealth, income inequality and corruption are some of the main problems plaguing the country, despite GDP growth that has averaged 8% over the years. Elsewhere on the continent, the cost of living has soared in Sudan, especially ever since South Sudan's secession in 2011. Africa's youngest state took 3/4 of Sudan's oil reserves with it when it left, and that's a problem for Sudan, because oil revenues there used to be the main source of revenue for its budget and for foreign currency income, which it needed to pay for vital imports. Sudanese citizens are now demanding that their government regulates the prices of commodities, especially food, which they say have simply become unaffordable.
In September last year, Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, was the scene of violent clashes pitting the police and demonstrators who were protesting against the high cost of food and fuel. Dozens of people were killed and hundreds of others injured. Today, the city is quiet, but the discontent of an increase in the cost of living continues to smolder. 2 weeks ago, a group of women took to the streets to protest.
The prices in general are not satisfactory for the people. The edible oil, tomatoes and lemon prices are high. Everything is high. Nothing is within the reach of the people. Sheep prices are also high. And in general, everything is expensive.
There is chaos in the market. Unfortunately, every merchant sells at the price he wants, and people are forced to buy at high prices. There's no monitoring of the markets.
Annual inflation was at 46.4% in August. Since South Sudan seceded, carrying with it 3/4 of the country's oil production in 2011, prices have spiked in Sudan. Oil is the main source of foreign currency, which it needs to support its economy and ensure the imports of food and other products in Sudan. Sudan is very famous for its fertile land and easy access to the Nile, but depends in part on food imports because its agricultural sector has been tainted for decades by mismanagement, corruption and high taxes. Last year, the government attempted to reduce the imports of wheat to stimulate local production and has offered a price equivalent at the global level, but the yields are still not enough to replace the billions of dollars of loss in oil revenues.
If we assume that the monthly salary of someone is 1,000 Sudanese pounds, then he buys a sheep at about 1,200 Sudanese pounds, that means that he will have no more money for the rest of the month.
There are 5 major reasons for the price hikes and other sub-causes. The 5 issues are the high US dollar exchange rate. There is also a decline in production of commodities, so the government imports those commodities. There is an international hike in commodities prices. Since September 2007 until now, there have been continuous hikes in the prices of rice, wheat, flour and edible oil. Another is the speculation, and the 5th is weak monitoring of markets by the government.
The exorbitant cost of living is a major issue featuring prominently in the elections next year. President Omar Hassan al-Bashir has remained in power for 25 years in spite of the armed rebellions, trade sanctions imposed by the US, an economic crisis, a coup attempt and an indictment of the International Criminal Court on charges of war crimes in the Western Darfur region. Penina Karibe, CCTV.
Let's move on to East Africa now. Kenyan bankers plan to launch a house price index this year. The idea is to produce a tool that can help policymakers get a broader view of changes in the economy and to also assist investors in managing risks, especially in the real estate sector. Now, this index will be designed to show changes in overall property prices as well as changes in specific property categories. It will initially cover the capital Nairobi, where property prices have risen fairly rapidly in recent years as demand has outpaced supply and speculative activity has just amplified the price changes. Now, the index will be calculated using data from a range of sources, valuation firms, insurance companies and mortgage financiers as well. Let's get you some more details on that. Jared Osoro is a policy and research manager at the Kenyan Bankers Association. He's with me in studio now. You're actually in charge of developing this index. We should make that very clear.
Yes.
What data sources are you going to use to compute this index?
Well, as you well know, an index is simply a statistical device on measuring changes in prices. And that requires you to have as comprehensive a database as possible for you to be able to compute the index. And the data source is basically not to have a population of all the houses that you're going to measure, but a reliable sample of information. And a good starting point is the data that is available within the banking arena. And that is both mortgages and other data that is within the banking space. The usual misconception is mortgages are few and therefore that data may not be adequate. But banks have data on housing that is well beyond the mortgage they provided. And this database is quite comprehensive in the sense that you have data on the value of the house, the location of the house, the insured value of the house beyond the very value of the house itself, and the specifics of the house itself.
Let's get into the specifics of that, because by end 2013, according to the central bank, there were about just under 20,000 mortgage accounts in the country. And for a lot of people who look at this data, they say, yeah, but that's actually a fairly small sample. Won't it limit?
Yeah, as I've just mentioned, you're right in pointing out that there are about 20,000 mortgages. But mortgages are just one way in which housing is financed by the financial system. The other avenues through which banks finance houses, not necessarily through the mortgage. For instance, somebody may be having savings and then goes to a bank for a medium-term loan that doesn't have to be secured on the property itself. And there's a component of it that now augments the 20,000 to make the data richer than the 20,000.
So like those individuals who will use their houses as collateral,
but
they're not actually taking out a mortgage.
Precisely. But beyond that, this index will not restrict itself to data from the banking system alone. We'll stretch it to include data from the property developers themselves. We include it from the insurance industry, for instance, and the cooperatives. And the reason why we are doing this is because we believe that the index is going to be a public good. And it will be of interest to them as it is to the financial sector itself.
But I mean, presumably you're not just going to walk into insurance companies and say, hey, we'd like your data. I mean, what procedures would you say, would you have to go through?
Certainly, because it's their data. What will happen is that we'll have to approach them formally and tell them that, no, we are developing this tool. We argue that the conceptual framework that we're putting in place will be easily amenable to players in the real estate sector, be they insurance, cooperatives, and any other interested parties. So once they buy into our conceptual framework, then it will be their interest also to share the data that they have. And the way this data is treated is going to be in a manner that is not going to be attributed to any particular source. In the sense that, you know, if you go, for instance, to an insurance company or a cooperative, what you're going to say is that, tell me the house that you financed. You can identify it as house number 1. Give me the attributes of the house. And the model that we've designed will go into a pool. And that pool is not identified to any particular segment of the housing sector.
So this is all anonymized information?
That is all anonymous information. And that is why it will be very easy for them to see the essence of sharing the data for purposes of ensuring that the index is reliable and credible enough.
All right, one last question for you. Given the data sources that you're using, banks, insurance companies, to what extent can you provide an accurate picture of the lower end of the housing market?
Well, there's an errant assumption that the housing that is supported by the financial sector is basically on the top end.
Well,
that may not necessarily.
If you have average mortgages at 7 million shillings, it was last year, that's a fairly big heap of money.
It is big, but I think from the data that we have from the banks already, there are mortgages that go as low as 3 million shillings, but they are not as many. And that is to tell you that the data that we have cuts across all segments of the economy in terms of the income brackets, though there's a tendency of it to be skewed towards the middle and the upper hand. Now, the kind of data that we are likely to get from other segments, like the cooperatives, for instance, may capture some of the lower end component of the market, and that therefore enrich the index so fast, cutting across all the segments of the income bracket is concerned.
All right. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but best of luck. When does this launch?
We are likely to launch it end of November. End of November. Certainly before the end of the year.
All right. Lovely. We're looking forward to that. Always more data is always welcome around here.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking to Jared Osoro. He's a policy and research manager at the Kenya Bankers Association, talking about the development of a housing index. We've always had a fairly muddled picture, if you will, of housing prices, the availability of housing across the Kenyan economy. Let's move on to South Africa. President Jacob Zuma has outlined a fairly ambitious plan for oil and gas exploration in coastal waters, which he says could contain as much as 9 billion barrels of crude oil and even more quantities of natural gas. He made those comments while speaking in Durban, and he added that the government plans to drill at least 30 exploratory wells over the next 10 years, and hopefully that might lead to daily oil output of about 300,000 barrels of crude a day. However, at the same time, he also stressed the significant uncertainty about the extent of South Africa's hydrocarbon reserves. Now, even though it has an abundance of other minerals like gold, platinum and coal, South Africa has always been a major oil importer. We're still in South Africa. That country is likely to cut its 2014 growth forecast next week, but the government does not expect the economy to slip into a recession. The finance minister says the conditions on which the budget was tabled in February have obviously deteriorated, and downward revisions are to be expected. South Africa is grappling with a slowdown in one of its key export markets, China of course, and a decline in mining output due to increasingly frequent labour unrest. It's also seen as being quite vulnerable to the tightening of monetary policy in the US, and that could raise the cost of its financing of its high budget and balance of payment deficits. The government's current growth forecast is 2.7% for the year. The budget deficit is forecast to be about 4% of GDP. Let's dig a little deeper into that particular story. Miriam Bemar joins us now live from London, and Sumitra Naidu is keeping a close eye on development over in South Africa. Sumitra, let's start with you. The IMF is forecasting just 1.4% GDP growth for South Africa this year, but Mr. Nene has a higher forecast of 2.7%. But can he credibly cling to that in his budget statement next week?
Well, Rama, not at all. I don't think so. And I think the new minister has realized. He did say back in August that he expected growth to come in lower for the year to around 1.8%. And he also acknowledged that the economy was facing some serious challenges. The 2.7% forecast was made back in February this year. And of course, quite a bit has happened since then. We had the mining strikes, we had power shortages, we had rand weakness, which has all caused quite a bit of strain on the economy. Now, Nhlanhla Nene has a tough road ahead. He has admitted that there are some serious problems that need to be tackled urgently, and is expected to announce a much lower growth target next week when he delivers his very first medium-term budget speech. So while he's being realistic about this pain this economy is feeling, he's optimistic that he can steer this ship. He's also confident that the economy will not slip into recession, Rama.
Indeed. Miriam, however, given the slowdown that we've seen in South Africa's mining sector, what other parts of the economy do investors think, on your end at least, South Africa can use to bootstrap a recovery?
Well, certainly, Rama, looking at sectors like industrial development, manufacturing and transportation have all been very much favored. But many investors and analysts that I spoke with are also quietly keen to see what South Africa will do with shale gas fracking. Although it's still deemed quite controversial, with the US, of course, the shale boom very much changing the global energy market, investors are more inclined to look at the alternative energy sources as a long-term position. Some experts estimate that South Africans' capacity at about 480 trillion cubic feet. Others, like Petroleum Agency of South Africa, put estimates at about 40 to 72%, and that's significant in terms of a difference. So investors are hoping that new money could actually unravel untapped the country's energy resources, and the expectation is that the government take those initial steps with shale gas extraction. It certainly can't be compared, of course, to the US or Europe, which have developed the technology for years, but experts are telling me that investors are optimistic that there's long-term growth there.
Indeed. Sumitra, coming to you, Mr. Nene is on record as well, saying difficult times are always an interesting opportunity for reform. But within his remit as finance minister, what can he really do to change South Africa's labour environment in his next budget?
Well, that's a tough one, Rama. Unlike the last two ministers, Trevor Manuel and Praveen Gordhan, the last two ministers of finance, Nhlanhla Nene doesn't have the struggle credentials and the political clout or influence, if you would call it, when it comes to making any changes in the labour sector. And that, of course, does remain a contentious issue within South Africa. And many are still calling for more labour flexibility. But Nene is looking at other areas to lift this economy. He's leaning towards some austerity measures, a cap on spending and a trimming the deficit. He does, though, want to continue with investing in infrastructure. Now, most economists seem to have confidence in the minister's abilities, but of course, all eyes will be on that budget speech next week to get more clarity on the state of the economy and the government's plans going forward. More importantly, I think it will be an opportunity to assess Nene, his thinking and his resolve. He's going to have quite a fight on his hands with the unions if he does go ahead with the austerity measures.
Indeed. We'll keep tabs on what he does say next week very closely indeed. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Miriam Behmad live in London, and of course Sumitra Naidu there live in Johannesburg, South Africa. Let's make a quick run through equity markets here for you. There's quite a bit of blood in the water, frankly, especially in South Africa. Down 2% on some of the main indices over there today, relatively flat in Egypt and Nigeria. We're keeping a close eye, however, on Kenya Airways over in Kenya. We know that it had hedged half of its fuel supplies for the 2014-2015 fiscal year by end of March this year. The question we're asking in light of what's happening with oil prices is how much pain are they going to face from those hedges given the decline in oil prices? Coming up next, we'll be looking at efforts to reduce carbon emissions in South Africa. Biojet fuel is the answer, apparently. And we'll also be looking at our series on unclogging Africa's busiest roads. We'll be in Kampala looking at its notorious traffic jams.
African leaders have been urged to make it easier to move and do business across borders within the African continent.
Africans should be free to move in their continent, to do business, to interact, if we are to grow the levels of investment and trade that will ensure that we are able to create the jobs for our people that we require.
Welcome back to the program. You're still watching Global Business Africa. Countries across the world are still struggling to reduce carbon emissions in everything from cars to factories to even aircraft. And biojet fuel is gradually getting more and more attention. Over in South Africa, the latest source of such green fuel, and I use that word lightly, isn't grain, it's tobacco. Angelo Coppola has more.
As climate change considerations take centre stage in many developing countries, the carbon footprint left by most airlines remains unacceptably high. Added to this is a weak currency to the US dollar.
Our fleet, our burning of our fuel when we fly, contributes about 97% of our carbon footprint. And the only way to effectively reduce that is with something like a biofuel.
The national flag carrier is hedging its bets. 75% of its projected biofuels will come from other unspecified sources. 25% of the biofuel will eventually be farmed on 25 to 30,000 hectares.
One of our biofuel projects is the Solaris Tobacco Project, which grows a modified form of tobacco. The tobacco has no nicotine, but it has enlarged seed pods. And in those seed pods, we crush those seeds and we get an oil. Then we take that oil, we refine that oil, and we produce a jet fuel from that oil.
It can be done because the technologies to extract the oil out of seeds are well known. The technologies to convert oil into jet fuel or biodiesel is well known. However, my concern is on the upper end, 5% of arable land is a little bit concerning.
The biofuels industry is a stop-start affair. For several years, the Departments of Energy and Agriculture have been trying to create a biofuel sector, with not much luck. It appears now that SAA may have found a legislative vacuum and are exploiting it.
Aviation fuels has almost been put aside because it is such small volumes. This has allowed us to actually make huge strides forward because we're operating in an environment where there are no sort of restrictions or boundaries.
South African Airways consumes around 10 million litres of jet fuel a day, and if projections are correct, SAA plan to generate around 2.5 million litres of that from jet biofuels. We'll see whether that does happen or not. I'm Angelo Coppola for CCTV at OR Tambo International Airport.
Let's continue our series on traffic in Africa, this time focusing on the Ugandan capital. Kampala has the worst traffic jams in that country, and experts there say it's mainly due to lousy and outdated urban planning. Michael Baleke has more.
Bumper-to-bumper traffic is the norm along this road leading to Uganda's international airport. People hoping to catch a flight often have to allow hours to get to the terminal. And this is the same story for all roads leading to Kampala city.
Traveled from Entebbe up to Kampala, but I've used at least 2.5 or 3 hours.
During morning hours, the jam is too much, and in some cases it requires you to really strain your pocket to use a boda.
The main cause of jam in this town, many cars coming in. Every individual wants to bring in a car.
Traffic in Kampala is heavy during the morning and evening rush hours, with Fridays and rainy seasons being the worst days. Although many walk, those who can afford take the motorcycle, locally known as the boda. However, it is a risky option and responsible for most registered road accidents. Uganda's economy is growing fast, and many locals can now afford a personal car because their incomes are much better.
The economy has been growing, and so many people have become rich, and therefore they have tended to move towards private transport as opposed to public transport. But also public transport has continued to be inefficient.
The reliance on private transport, as well as the number of low-capacity minibuses, has not only increased the demand for road space, but has also contributed to the escalating traffic jam in the capital.
According to city authorities, a new physical development plan approved last year will help address the traffic congestion problem in Kampala.
In the short run, what we can do is to ensure that we have an effective public transport system in place, and we are almost finalizing the procurement for buses, and what these buses will do will be to do the town run. And so the commuter taxis, commonly known as taxis or matatu, will be left at the outskirts of the city.
Authorities say the public transport system, which also includes a passenger train service, starts before the end of the year. That system will hopefully ease congestion in Kampala, a city that was built for around 1 million people, but is now home to more than 4 million. Michael Baleke, CCTV, Kampala.
Unemployment, company closures and a decade-long economic crisis in Zimbabwe has prompted a surge in more informal trading through SMEs. As Walter Carrells reports, however, economists say that a lack of formal registration for these firms, as well as unclear guidelines, are a growing problem.
Several Zimbabweans who lost their jobs through company retrenchments have set up their own small, medium-sized enterprises. This has not been out of choice or opportunity, but out of necessity, as soaring unemployment and continued company closures remain a concern.
This sector is an exciting sector, and I believe if they get what they want, they will make Zimbabwe boom.
Analysts see SMEs as one of the answers to help get Zimbabwe's economy back on its feet. However, the majority of them are not registered and operate illegally, making it impossible for the government to collect taxes in the sector. But most Zimbabweans venturing into SMEs prefer it that way, since they still have to worry about bank loans, training, and a lack of information to sustain business and to attract investment into the sector.
Now I can own my own company. I can do things at my own pace. Because do you know it's really exciting to own your own company rather than working for other people. As much as it's very difficult, but I believe if you are on your own, you know what to do, because that's where your food is going to come from.
According to the FinScope survey of 2012, the SME sector in Zimbabwe has an estimated $7.4 billion circulating within it, with over 5 million people employed in the sector. Walter Carrells, CCTV.
And that's it for this edition of Global Business. Thank you so much for watching. Let's do it again in 23 hours. I'm Ramanya.